Oh, thanks, Phil, for that introduction, and thank you for those who are able to join us for this update on diseases we're seeing in corn and soybean. So this talk is going to kind of go through diseases where we can do some things in season, mainly applying a fungicide, but I'll also cover some diseases where by now it's too late to do anything to control them, especially root rots and bacterial diseases. But to help us making management decisions for future seasons so that we know how to recognize those diseases and what can be done to manage these diseases. So I'll start with soybeans and go through what we're seeing currently. Um, and again, most of these diseases are going to be things you know, but it's going to be just a reminder for us um, what to look for and how these symptoms look like. So I'm starting with brown spot or Septoria spot. So this disease is pretty common in soybeans. You're pretty much going to find it in any soybean field you visit. It's going to be in the lower canopy. It starts from the lower canopy and then moves to the middle canopy and sometimes may reach the top canopy. But the reason you're going to find brown spot in the lower canopy is because of the high moisture, and these leaves don't dry as quickly as the upper leaves. And so this fungus requires high humidity, more hours of leaf wetness in order for it to develop. It's a residue-borne disease. Again, that's why you're gonna find it in the lower leaves first. We have other residue-borne diseases that you might see on top leaves, but for the most part, if you see a disease on the lower canopy, that is gonna indicate that it is coming from residue. And also, this disease, when it is severe, as you can see here, it's going to cause that yellowing premature leaf fall as well. And so that's how it progresses. You can see that half of this leaf is pretty yellow and the other half is not. And the half that's not yellow is not showing a lot of brown spots. So when you have a lot of these spots developing on the leaf can start yellowing and prematurely drop. And so if this is happening in the middle canopy, then you can have yield loss caused by this disease. But for the most part, it is really a minor disease that we don't worry about in terms of applying a fungicide. But if the field is soybean on soybean, or we have really narrow row spacing where this disease is starting to move into the middle canopy, especially around this time, R3, R4, when we recommend a fungicide, then a fungicide would be justified to control this disease. But again, as I mentioned, this is usually a minor disease, keeps in the lower old leaves. Rarely does it move to the middle and upper canopy to cause significant yield loss. So we also have Frogeye leaf spot. This picture is from last year. So I have not seen yet Frogeye leaf spot reaching this level. But Frogeye leaf spot can really develop to reach high levels. You're gonna find it mainly in the upper leaves. That's where infection will develop. So young developing leaves are more susceptible to Frogeye leaf, so kind of the opposite with brown spot. The inoculum can also come from seed, but for the most part, we get this disease from residue from previous seasons. And one way to know that you have Frogeye leaf spot is to look at the margins of the lesion, where it's going to be surrounded by a dark brown halo around the lesion, and then the center has a tan color to it. So this is how you can know you have Frogeye leaf spot. And you can see here, this leaf is really having severe levels of Frogeye leaf spot. And very soon, this disease can lead to premature leaf fall. And so since it is going to appear mainly in the upper leaves, if you're losing upper leaves, you're definitely losing yield. The other thing we need to know about this disease is that it will develop starting from R1 because it is favored by warmer temperatures. So earlier in the season, you're likely not to see Frogeye leaf spot just because temperatures are a little bit on the cooler side. So, but like now when we're pretty warm and wet, this is when Frogeye leaf spot will start to develop. So sometimes symptoms symptoms of Frogeye leaf spot can be confused with herbicide injury. So I have here two examples. Here on the left, we have a soybean leaf with some herbicide injury, and you can see some of these lesions really look like Frogeye leaf spot. But if you don't have that tan center and with a dark brown ring around the lesion, then that is not going to be Frogeye leaf spot, but something else. So especially where you know, herbicide is applied with some adjuvants or surfactants, you know, can cause leaves to be injured in that nature. Here is another picture on the right. Again, I don't know which mode of action would have been used for this herbicide, but especially in the lower leaves, you might see lesions that mimic or look like Frogeye leaf spot, but actually this would be from a herbicide injury, especially if you can see it on every leaf, every plant. That is likely not to be because of Frogeye leaf spot. So the next disease that you're likely to see out there this season is the Cercospora leaf blight. Sometimes this disease is also called the purple seed stain. And the main characteristic of this disease is the purpling of the leaves. Forgive me for this typo. So this should read as purpling is seen mainly in the edges of the leaf, not seed. So that's a typo in that bullet. But so if you see this kind of purpling at the edges, mainly on the edges of the leaf moving in, that would be because of Cercospora leaf blight. And we also have other problems in the field that can look like Cercospora leaf blight. I'll go through these. The inoculum comes from also residue, previous season residue that was where the soybean were infected with this disease. But it can also come from seed, and I have an example that I'll show you. It's also a disease we see a little bit later in the season. So early on in the season, it may be there, but symptoms are not very clear. However, as the season progresses, you might see this purpling of leaves at the edges, and that can be due to Cercospora leaf blight. So here's an example where I mentioned that this disease can be seed-borne. We had some seeds harvested from soybeans, and we knew those soybean plants had the Cercospora leaf blight. And so we planted these in the greenhouse, so nothing else would have caused the disease other than coming from the seed. So these are young seedlings, and you can see they have that purpling again on the leaves, indicating that this inoculum would have come from the seed. So Cercospora leaf blight can be transmitted through seed, but usually we see the main source being the residue and not the seed, since seed companies do a good job in spraying their seed crops. And so we don't expect the disease to be coming from the seed, but rather from the residue from previous seasons. So here is another injury that can happen in soybean that can be confused with Cercospora leaf blight. So this is sunburn, and it's going to happen on the underneath of the leaf, and sometimes where you have windy conditions and the leaf is tanned, exposing the underside. And so the underside can have injury from the sun, you know, sunburn or sunbald, sun scald, but this is different from Cercospora. So Cercospora again is going to be the purpling on the upper side of the leaf, and usually starts from the edges and expands moving in. So do not confuse sunburn to Cercospora, because the sunburn is going to be on the underside of the leaf. Here is another injury from herbicides that can look like Cercospora, but again, just make sure that you're checking the edges, and the color should kind of fade in going in. But where you have the entire leaf looking like this, this is going to be due to herbicides and not due to Cercospora leaf blight. We are seeing a little bit of downy mildew this year. It's not a whole lot out there. Actually, you can easily miss it out because it's just mild. But where you see this sort of chlorotic spots on the upper part of the leaf that look kind of light yellow, and they're really small, irregular, they don't have any shape to them, that could be due to downy mildew, which is a fungal disease. It's more common where you have frequent rains, and it's also going to be developing in the upper leaves. You're likely not to see it in the lower leaves. So if you see symptoms that look like this, that could be due to downy mildew. One way to confirm this disease is to turn the underside of the leaf, and you should see this kind of fuzzy gray-like symptoms underneath the leaf due to downy mildew. If you don't see this type of symptoms on the other side of the leaf, that could be something else and not downy mildew. It's usually a minor disease. Again, it's also going to be common where you have frequent rains, but where a variety is susceptible, where the disease sets in early, it can cause some significant disease development leading to yield loss. So keep an eye out there when you're scouting to see if you have downy mildew. It's going to come from residue, and susceptibility between varieties varies. So where you have a high level of this disease would mean that that variety is pretty susceptible. For the most part, I haven't seen such a level of downy mildew where I would recommend a fungicide. It's usually just minor and on the upper leaves only. So those are some of the diseases that could develop in season that can be managed using a fungicide. And so the question is always, is a fungicide profitable in soybeans? If I apply a fungicide in soybeans, do I get resultant yield that can pay for the cost, but also, have a balance as a profit? So we have here a few data to share with you. But for the most part, we really don't see a good yield response that is statistically significant across a number of treatments. So like last year here, you can see we applied almost 6 products here. This was applied at R3, so beginning potting. So between R3 and R4 is when these fungicides were applied. This was in vogue. And based on just the disease pressure, you can see that we don't get a lot of disease on soybeans. So here is where we have Cercospora and then brown spot. Even in the non-treated plots, you can see we have such a little disease to require applying a fungicide. And so it's possible that that's why we're not seeing a good response to fungicides in soybeans. In some products, yeah, perhaps there might be some significant difference, especially where it comes to yield benefit, physiological benefits from some of the strobe fungicides, but we would recommend using a fungicide where it's justified. In other words, we are seeing more disease pressure to require applying a fungicide. But we don't see a consistent yield response when we put fungicides between R3 and R4 for controlling some of these foliar diseases. Now, where a fungicide is going to be really effective is where a field has had a history of white mold, and so a fungicide is timed at R1 to control white mold. So those investments usually pay off, because if a field is getting a lot of white mold, it can really take a toll on yield. And so I am not covering white mold in this talk just because we are past R1, where a fungicide would be recommended for controlling white mold in soybeans. So here are also results from field strip trials. So this is where field length strip is treated with a fungicide and then compared with non-treated gericide by side. This work is done by the on-farm research sponsored by the Soybean Research and Promotion Council. It's a project headed by Professor Clay. And so these results are online. You can check them out on this link. But for the most part, and this is just looking at 2019, they have trials all the way from 2016. And when you look at the majority of the on-farm trials where a fungicide was applied either at R1 or R3, you don't see a good consistent response to fungicide application. So here's can be seen in this table, excuse me, just 2 trials in Davison County where you had some positive response to fungicide application. But for the most part, yeah, you don't see really a good response that's consistent where you apply a fungicide in soybeans, even considering the strip trials. Of course, conditions vary from one field to another and from one year to another. And so depending on your field history, the variety, susceptibility to some of these diseases, especially white mold, you could see a good response, a positive return to fungicide application in soybeans. But for the most part, it's not really consistent or something you can be assured that if you make that investment, you're likely to have a positive return on a fungicide application. So just looking at fungicide in soybeans, as I was saying, that the response to fungicide is going to be driven by disease pressure. If you have to apply the fungicide, because most of these diseases are going to develop a little bit later in the season, so we're looking at R3, R4 as your best timing. Because if you apply that fungicide very early on in the season, let's say R1, a disease like Frogeye Extens that develops much later in the season, you may not have a good residual left by the time these fungicides are, by the time these diseases are showing up. And so that's why a later fungicide application for controlling foliar diseases is going to be more effective. Except the exception being white mold. If you're controlling white mold, then your best timing is going to be at R1. When it comes to the efficacy of fungicides controlling brown spot, Cercospora, Downy mildew, Frogeye Extens, they are pretty good. So they are rated between good and very good against most of the foliar diseases. Again, the only exception is going to be if white mold has specific active ingredients you want to be thinking of if you're controlling white mold. Also, for Frogeye Extens, we have found out in South Dakota that we do have resistance to this fungicide class. Excuse me. And so if you are controlling Frogeye Extens, you may want to think about other fungicides other than the strobilurine fungicides, which have been found not to work for Frogeye Extens management. So this is the slide that I'm talking about. Being careful when you're controlling Frogeye Extens not to use QI or FRAC code 11 fungicides, as these, we have found isolates of this fungus that are resistant to strobes. And these were pretty widespread, especially in the southern east part of the state. So from Union County to Davison County, we have found isolates that are resistant to strobilurine. So it's most probable that even in other counties where we haven't isolated this fungus to be resistant to strobilurine, it's very possible that some of these could be. So as a word of caution, just mix in other modes of action like CDHIs or triazoles, so that's group 3 and group 7, and don't simply use just one group to control these fungal pathogens as they can evolve and develop resistance to fungicides being applied. So other diseases in soybeans, be aware of as you scout. We have bacterial leaf blight that is pretty common. It can look like a brown spot, But the way to tell is look for these tiny little brown looking spots on the leaves that are surrounded by a yellow halo. So that's really the distinction between bacterial leaf blight and brown spot. Otherwise, it can look pretty much the same. So the brown spot do not have the yellow halo around them. And also the other characteristic is the tearing of leaves, where you have larger lesions of the bacterial blight. And also the bacteria usually would have sort of like a water soaking sign or symptom to them. And so that can help to differentiate between brown spot and bacterial blight. But this disease is pretty common. The disease is going to develop on the upper leaves, whereas the brown spot is going to be more on the lower parts of the plant. So that's another distinction that can help you when you're scouting to tell between a brown spot and a bacterial blight. Of course, we don't want to make decisions to apply a fungicide when we're only looking at brown bacterial blight, mistaking it for brown spot. So be aware of how you can tell the two apart. But these two diseases are pretty common. Every field you go to, you're likely to see a bacterial blight as well as a brown spot. We have sudden death syndrome that you're likely to find this year, especially in areas where we've had a lot of moisture. So here I'm just giving you a quick reminder how to tell sudden death syndrome from other diseases out there. So where you have these bright yellow blotches in the leaves between veins, when the symptoms are advanced, of course, those yellow blotches are going to die out. And so you have these tan brown lesions on a soybean leaf that has SDS. And as time goes on, you may have the entire tissue between leaf veins dying, but leaving the veins green. So green veins is usually one of the characteristics we look at for sudden death syndrome, but we also have other diseases like brown stem rot, or sometimes when white mold is just starting, it can look like SDS. So the very confirmatory sign of sudden death syndrome is to look for this blue mycelia. If the soil is a little bit wet and then the plant is uprooted, you might see this blue mycelia, and that's a telltale or a sign of this SDS pathogen. But as you scout, be aware of SDS symptoms. It's one disease that is increasingly becoming common in South Dakota, so know how to differentiate this disease from other diseases. When it comes to managing SDS, basically your best bet is using seed treatment, and we also have some varieties that are tolerant. We don't have resistance in most of the maturity groups we're growing. Seed treatments, we have iLevo. We also have a new one, Saltro, that is pretty good against sudden death. So these seed treatments can help. Phytophthora is pretty common. In fact, this picture was taken yesterday somewhere in Hutchinson County. This disease, you're likely to see it in low spot areas or field entrance areas where you have some water, excessive soil moisture. And the best way to tell that you have Phytophthora, which can look like other diseases like stem canker, is look for this kind of syrup color, this maple syrup color that is moving from the soil line above, is moving above the soil line on the stem. So if it was stem canker, this wouldn't start from the soil line, and you'd also have the lesion interrupted with a green on the stem if it was stem canker. So if you have a lesion starting from the soil line moving up the plant, most likely that is going to be Phytophthora. And again, you're likely to see it in the lower parts of the field where there's excessive moisture, or field entrances where you may have some compaction issues. So of course, with managing Phytophthora is to use RPS genes that are good against this disease, mainly RPS 2, 3s, 6, 8. You want to stay away from RPS 7 and 1s. Those tend to be defeated by this disease often. So Phytophthora, management is to use RPS genes or plus also seed treatments. Seed treatments with methotrexate or mefenoxam are pretty good against Phytophthora, but we have to remember that this disease can kill plants throughout the season. So this is July, or going into August. If you put in a seed treatment, it's not going to last the entire season. So a combination of seed treatments and RPS genes is a sure way to manage Phytophthora rot. FCN, a quick reminder about this nematode in the soil, now being found in 34 counties. And so it's really expanding out in a lot of areas where soybean is grown. You may not see above the ground symptoms, but where there's really high density, you can see this yellowing and stunting of plants due to the SCN. But for the most part, where you have low soil density of the nematode around less than 6,000 eggs per 100 cc of soil, you may not see above ground symptoms as seen in this picture. And so SCN is best managed using resistant varieties. But it's important to switch between these sources of resistance. So not only rely on PI 88788, but also mix in with picking and other types of other sources of resistance against this SCN. We also have some seed treatments like iLevo again and Saltro. Those two products have efficacy against SDS and also against SCN. So of course, you want to test your soil. It is free of charge to know if you have SCN, and therefore you can plan better in future using resistance or seed treatments, especially where you have high SCN numbers in the soil. So I'm gonna now switch to corn diseases, but if you have any question on the soybean diseases, diagnosing those diseases and how to manage them, we can discuss that after the corn. A quick look at through corn diseases. So one common disease you might see, although it's very light on most of the corn fields, is gray leaf spot. So this disease is best characterized by looking at the shape of the lesions. It's usually a regular rectangular lesion between veins. And so this is one of the best ways to tell you have gray leaf spot is simply to look at the shape of the lesion. Now it is a new disease, which I'll share in a minute, that can also look like gray leaf spot, but the fact that you have these shorter lesions that are so almost linear between the veins, this would tell you that you have tan spot. And of course, the color also is tan, and the leaf margin, the lesion margins are pretty clear, and you have no water soaking or the margins being wavy. You will see gray spots start to develop a bit later in the season as well. So it's not something you'll see earlier in the season. And again, the shape is rectangular and they are interrupted lesions. So you just have shorter lesions on the leaves. So as I mentioned, this disease is usually very light. Even where I've seen this disease, it's, for example, by this level, it's pretty late in the season. We're talking of dents and after dent, where a fungicide may not be needed to control this disease. But in some years where the disease might show up a little early or the hybrid is very susceptible, then you want to think of a fungicide right at R1, which is sulking. Northern corn leaf blight is another fungal disease that you're likely to see on corn. For the most part, where I've seen this disease, you just have 2 or 3 lesions on the leaf, and just maybe 1 or 2 leaves, not like the entire plant having lesions all over. So it's also very light in our environment. The shape of the lesion is more elliptical and also cigar shaped. So that's one way you can tell northern corn leaf blight. Sometimes it can be confused with Gauss's wilt. I'll share a few pictures of Gauss's wilt, but the fact that you don't have the black freckles and also water soaking of the lesion, then that helps us to know we have the northern corn leaf blight and not the bacterial disease. But also the shape, of course, for northern corn leaf blight is going to be the cigar shape, and it's very characteristic of this disease. So again, this disease is pretty low in terms of its intensity in our corn fields. I have not seen where this disease is so severe that I would have recommended using a fungicide. It's going to come from residue, but also can be blown in from other fields. And so it's going to be promoted by also high humidity, frequent rains, where leaves may remain wet for a while, and warmer temperatures. So again, another reason we might see this disease after tasseling. Eyespot is starting to develop. This picture was taken not far from Brookings. It is characterized by really small circular lesions, as can be seen in this picture. The color is tan in the center. They can also have a small dark brown ring around them. And when you hold against light, you can see the yellow halo around the lesions pretty well. But where you see these tiny little circular lesions on the leaves, that is likely to be eyespot. This disease can actually develop on any part of the plant. So you can have it on the lower leaves, you can have it on the uppermost leaves where conditions are favorable or where the hybrid is susceptible. You can have severe eyespot that perhaps could impact yield. So the best way to manage this disease is to make sure you look at the hybrids rating for eyespot. So a better hybrid can be selected, but also fungicides are pretty effective against eyespot if it is a problem in the field. Common rust is very common. You'll see it in any field you visit, except for the most part, you will see this level of common rust towards the end of the season. You also see this along the field edges where the inoculum comes in first. Excuse me. But usually when you go inside the field, rarely do you see such a high level of common rust. So that's why we feel it's a negligible disease. It doesn't really cause a significant yield loss for us to worry about, but except where you have a susceptible hybrid and then you're having this sort of other severity, it could take out some yield in the crop. Perhaps one disease that we really should be looking out this season is southern rust, because just yesterday I found some of this disease in Yankton County. And for me, this year would be the earliest we have found this disease in corn. The reason we worry about southern rust is because we don't have really good resistance in most of the hybrids that are planted. And if it comes in early and we have a lot of moisture, it can really take off and cause significant yield loss. So for the last 7 years, I have seen this disease way late in the season, like after dent growth stage, so where a fungicide would not be necessary. But this year, this is the first, and I'm also hearing even reports in Nebraska, they're saying this is the earliest they have seen it in a number of counties. So be on the lookout for southern rust, and corn just tasseled, it's beginning silking, or maybe some of it may be at the blister growth stage. And so a fungicide for fields that are starting to have southern rust may be recommended, because this disease can really develop and become severe and cause significant yield losses. So the question is going to be how to tell southern rust from common rust. It's pretty easy actually to tell the two apart. So southern rust is going to be more clustered, as you can see in this picture. Excuse me. And then also the color is more to the orange, yellowish type, whereas for common rust, seen here in the upper picture, it's going to be sort of random on the leaf, and the color is going to be a bit dark red. So you can really tell the two apart, except where you see only one, you may not be sure which is which. And so knowing the color and also the pattern for which these lesions are distributed on the leaf can help you determine whether you have southern rust, which is more yellow and clustered, or common rust, which is more random on the leaf, and the color is towards being red or dark red. Also, if you hold the southern rust leaf against light, you see very clear a yellow halo around the lesions. But for common rust, you won't see any yellow ring where the pustules of this southern rust of common rust are developing. So that between the color, the distribution of these pustules on the leaf, and also the yellow halo around the lesions, these three characteristics can help you to tell common rust from southern rust. So then also the question is, can we see a good response to fungicide application in corn? And so the diseases I just went through can be well managed by using a fungicide. So we looked at gray leaf spot, we looked at northern corn leaf blight, we looked at Eyespot, we looked at common rust, and then southern rust. So these 5 diseases can be very well controlled by a fungicide. However, the question is, do we see enough disease pressure to warrant the use of a fungicide, and therefore we expect to see a good response to a fungicide? And for the past seasons, we really don't see a lot of disease, and I did mention this as I reviewed each of those diseases. So even last year, we had a trial where we looked at, again, about 6 fungicides, and these were applied at R1, so that's at silking. And you can see that the Eyespot was the only disease, and in the non-treated plots, we had less than 2% of this disease. So the fact that you really don't see a lot of disease pressure perhaps is why we're not seeing a significant yield difference when we do the statistics on the yield data. I've also seen research data from my colleagues in other states, and really where they see a good yield response that is significant is where you have more than 5% of disease pressure on the leaves. And so they really get a lot of disease pressure, gray leaf spot, northern leaf blight, southern rust, Nebraska, southern states, really get good disease pressure. So that's why they are seeing a good response to fungicide application. But in our environment, I believe that we are still really lucky that we don't have a lot of disease pressure to worry about. And so we may not need to apply a fungicide, except in some cases if you have corn on corn, irrigated corn, or where diseases like southern rust are coming in early, then a fungicide would be justified. So again, that investment would melt the reason for applying it. So if you have to apply a fungicide in corn, the major reason again should be that you're seeing good disease pressure that would melt or warrant applying a fungicide, and then you want to time that fungicide at VTR1. Some of the colleagues I've talked to, and also some producers have said they have put fungicide on V6, but I feel like that is really too early before even some of these diseases start to show up. So VT, so tasseling R1 silking would be a better growth stage for applying a fungicide if you have to in corn. So other diseases that you're likely to see, so these are diseases where you can't do anything in the season, would mainly be bacterial diseases. So we have bacterial leaf streak. This is a relatively new disease, having been found just about 2 years ago. And this is the disease that can look like gray leaf spot. The only difference is that these are much longer lesions, and also they have a wavy margin. If you remember, the gray leaf spot is going to have a very regular lesion, but also shorter and between the veins. Whereas for the bacterial leaf streak, you have pretty long lesions and they have a wavy margin, as I'll show in the next image. So make sure that you're scouting and diagnosing this disease as well before you apply a fungicide thinking you have a fungal disease. So as I mentioned, this bacterial disease has much longer lesion that has a wavy margin, and also has some wetness along those edges of the lesion. So based on the length and the wavy margin and the water soaking, that should help you to rule out aggressive spot. And so do not apply a fungicide when you're trying to control bacterial disease. Here is a picture on the right where you have advanced symptoms, but again, you still have the wavy margins along these lesions. And then you also have that kind of wet look or a water soaking in those lesions. So again, it's pretty clear that you can tell the bacterial leaf blight, leaf streak in corn are from aggressive spot. Gaseous wilt is a common disease we see in a lot of cornfields, usually on a few plants, unless, excuse me, if the hybrid is super susceptible. But being bacteria also, you're gonna see this water soaking of bacterial lesions. And for gaseous wilt, the major diagnostic feature is gonna be the black freckles in the lesion. And when this lesion is held against the light, you will see these transparent spots in the leaf. That's really typical of gaseous wilt, but again, black freckles, longer, larger lesions. These signs, these symptoms will help you to tell gaseous wilt from other problems like northern corn leaf blight. So as you scout again, be aware of the bacterial diseases which do not need a fungicide in season, and also the fungal diseases which may benefit from a fungicide. So depending on your diagnosis, then you can make that management decision. You might also see lesion mimics out there. And so this is where the entire plant has these tiny little dots that are surrounding the entire leaf. So this is going to be more genetic than a disease, but sometimes it can be confused to be either a virus disease or an Eyespot disease just starting. But wherever you see sort of a systemic, same level of development of these lesions on the entire plant, and just usually a single plant or a few plants in the field, that likely is going to be due to lesion mimics, and it's not going to be due to disease caused by a biological agent. So with that, I'm going to summarize this talk, that most of the diseases are going to start to develop after R1. So in soybeans, that would be when initial flowers are forming. That's when we see most of the diseases that are going to develop and perhaps be significant. So brown spots moving in the middle canopy, you have Cercospora showing up, you have Frogeye leaf spot showing up. So R1 is that stage where you might see a lot of disease develop, even in corn. That's when you may see northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot, common rust. Common rust is pretty much around the crop the entire year, but the entire cropping season. But for the most part, the rest of the diseases usually develop after R1. Make sure you're diagnosing these diseases well. So if you're making management decisions, they're based on what requires that management. For example, a fungicide application should be because you are seeing fungal diseases and not because of bacterial diseases. Fungicides in corn and soybean, we don't see a good consistent yield response to these products, but if you have to apply them, for soybean, R3, R4 is the best stage for looking at foliar diseases other than white mold. And then for corn, it's R1 if you're controlling these foliar fungal diseases. So with that, if you have any questions or you need help with diagnosis, I can be reached at the information as shown on this slide. Be happy to come and scout with you or take a look and see what is going on. And so feel free to contact me anytime or any of my colleagues to help you with the diagnostic needs.